Good afternoon. On behalf of the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero, I'd like to welcome you and our good friends watching us on C-SPAN to the McGowan Theater, located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Rod Ross, an archivist with the Center for Legislative Archives. Today, we are privileged that author Tony Pitch has come to talk about his latest book, Our Crime Was Being Jewish. But first, I'd like to alert you to a couple of other programs coming up next week here in the McGowan Theater. On Tuesday, July 14th at noon, Aaron Mahan, Chief Historian of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, will lead a discussion on the contributions of former Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird during the Vietnam War. Our partner for this program is the Historical Office of the Secretary of Defense. And the next day, July 15th, Wednesday, at noon, historian Michael Nyberg will be here to talk about his book, Potsdam, The End of World War II and the Remaking of Europe. A book signing will follow the program, just as one will follow today's program. To learn more about these and all our other programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online. There are copies in the lobby, along with a sign-up sheet, so you can receive it by regular mail or email. Also, you'll find brochures about other National Archives programs and activities. Another way to get involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its education and outreach programs. Pick up your application for membership in the lobby or become a member online at archivesfoundation.org. Our subject today is the Holocaust, Hitler's planned eradication of European Jews during World War II. The Nazis' persecution began years before the war started, but the full extent of their pursuit of the final solution remained unintelligible, unimaginable to the outside world until the fall of the Third Reich. The Allied armies captured the records of the Nazis kept and recorded the liberation of the camps in photos and text. The documentation, now preserved in the National Archives, was used as evidence in the war crimes trials to document the actions and thoughts of those who carried out the crimes and those who discovered the results. But what of the stories of those trapped within the camps? In today's featured book, we have nearly 600 of their stories, including that of my sister-in-law's mother. Offered without commentary, the recollections show us the unfolding persecution through the survivors' eyes. Since the end of the war, we have been urged to never forget. Books like Our Crime Was Being Jewish ensure that we do not. Anthony S. Pitch is a journalist of note who long ago abandoned his native England for the United States. Of his many nonfiction books, the two I'm most familiar with are the award-winning They Have Killed Papa Dead, subtitled The Road to Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln's Murder and the Rage for Vengeance, and The Burning of Washington, The British Invasion of 1814. Some years back, I remember reading in the Washington Post that Tony's War of 1812 book was one President Bush had packed for summer reading. Tony Pitch has been featured on previous C-SPAN TV shows, as well as on the History Channel, National Geographic TV, Book TV, NPR, and PBS. As a journalist, he covered stories in England, Africa, and Israel. He has been a broadcast editor for the Associated Press and a senior writer for the U.S. News and World Report's Books Division. I first met him in the 1990s when I took one of his Smithsonian Associates walking tours of restaurants in Adams Morgan here in Washington. I can also attest that Tony gives a first-class walking tour of sites associated with Lincoln's assassination. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tony Pitch.
Thank you very much, Rod. I want to pay tribute to Rod, who helped me enormously in my previous books, and even the one coming out in March next year on Lynch, They Got Away with Murder. He's a very good archivist. Thank you, Rod. And also to all those archivists here and Archives 2 in College Park. Without them, I couldn't write any of these books. Now, The Crime of Being Jewish, Our Crime Was Being Jewish, I think is a marvelous title. It's taken from one man's interview where he said, my crime was being Jewish, and I thought that's great. It sums it all up. You may think that this is a book about the horrors of the Holocaust. Actually, it's really about heritage. The importance of knowing what happened in the past. And the survivors showed us, people of all faiths, that guts and wits can outflank savagery. Where are the Nazi leaders nowadays? They're all dead, gone by the ignominious act by their own hands of suicide. Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, and Himmler were mass murderers and the trash of history. And what about the survivors? Well, before that, they said that their Third Reich would last for 1,000 years. It didn't last 2 decades. What about the survivors? They were not liquidated like so many wanted them to be. They were descended from a long line of Jews who had faced hatred and conquest, pogroms and expulsions, forced conversions, and then the greatest affliction of all, the Holocaust. The tormentors included the pharaohs who enslaved them for many years, Babylonians, Persians, Romans, and then in the ensuing centuries, people of many different shades, and they survived. Now, as I'm in my closing years of life, it's time to sum up. And I am even more convinced that the survival of the Jewish people is truly phenomenal. And if anything, if we judge the past of what they survived in the past, I am absolutely convinced that they will overcome this current rise of anti-Semitism that has raised its murderous head worldwide so soon after the Holocaust. That is what surprises me, that within a generation it would happen, or the rumblings of it would come again, would surface again. Now, my hope is that this book will be read by people of all ages and all faiths, for people who know nothing or little about the Holocaust, for people who are ignorant of their heritage, and for those who don't realize that if anti-Semitism is taken to its extreme, it must result in the contents of this book. For this book, I researched the interviews at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Shoah Foundation, the International Military Tribunals in Nuremberg, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, hearings before the US House of Representatives, and even personal memoirs. And so I got a very, very good view of what it's about. Now, there are hundreds of interviews in this book. You don't have to read hundreds of books, it's all in this one. And I think that the survivors have a right to hold their heads high because they recount in their own words the enormous number of atrocities, the whole range that they had to confront and survive. And you get a good sense of what it's like. Now, it might frighten some people and shock others to read this, but you can't write about the Holocaust without writing it exactly as it was. And that's what I did, in their words. My preface, but the rest is their words, excerpted to show these atrocities. You will not find a chronology in this book because I wanted it's a reflection really of their shattered lives. And I didn't write an index because many people who would have been included were silenced by murder. Always remember what a Holocaust survivor told another woman who said to her, I can't watch Holocaust movies or read books about them because it's too sad. And the survivor said, don't expect me to pat you on the back. If we could live it, you can watch it. There is so much wisdom in this book. Not my wisdom, but theirs. The interviews, it's so amazing what they wrote about. And as I go through now, some of those excerpts, you'll see the wisdom that comes out of it. This book was really prompted by revolting, despicable anti-Semitism in France, epitomized by the antics of a so-called comedian. He's called Dieudonné Mbala, Cameroonian father, French mother. And he has one skit called Shawananas, where he ridicules the Holocaust. And later he makes fun of Ilan Halimi, who was an innocent Frenchman who was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered only because he was Jewish. And the audiences roar with laughter. It's on YouTube, you can see them. And you cannot say that his birth long after the Holocaust is justified by this late coming. Dieudonné Mbala says all these things when he wasn't even there. And I think that the best answer I could give him would be the words of those who came out alive. Now, Jews have always defied the odds, even though they were targeted because they were Jewish. They've defied the odds. These were people who bequeathed a triumphant heritage of endurance. That's what it's all about. And my book testifies to this everlasting resilience. Many anti-Semites say that the Holocaust never happened, but they cannot answer a survivor who told me shortly before his death last year, if the Holocaust didn't happen, then where is my family? And you have to listen to a Lutheran who helped liberate Buchenwald concentration camp. And after seeing the crematoria, the blood-stained walls, and the piles of corpses, he said, I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. I can testify. And another man had nothing but contempt for deniers. He said they should have been there, seen it with their own eyes. Then they would find out it really happened. And another man who helped free Ebensee concentration camp, he saw a room full of 500 bodies, and he said, you don't forget something like that, you can't. Another American soldier saw railroad cars packed with dead bodies, And he said, "I wish I had never seen anything like that. I hope I never see it again." Now, some people managed to hide, finding refuge in the city sewers. That's where children played with rats, just like those abroad fondled dogs. And that's where a man drowned in a sudden flash flood while looking for something to drink. That's where a woman suffocated her baby to death rather than let its cries betray their whereabouts. Shortly before they fled Vienna in 1938, a mother took her children to Schönbrunn Park, and she wanted them to see the sign at the entrance gate. And she told them never, ever to forget what was written there. And the words read, "Jews and dogs are not allowed in the park." And then hatred of Jews was displayed without any shame. There was a distinguished Jewish lawyer who went to the same Viennese coffee house for more than 20 years. And he sat at the same table, served by the same waiter. And after the Holocaust, after the Anschluss, the union of Greece and, Germany and Austria in 1938, the waiter came up to him, showed him his lapel pill signifying membership in the Nazi Party, and he said, "I don't wait on dirty Jews." Why didn't they bolt while time still seemed to be on their side? Perhaps they were too ensconced in the culture and they didn't appreciate the peril to their lives. There was a doctor in Berlin who told his son that he would not be taking up a position in a hospital in Brazil because, he said, Nazi rule will not last, the Germans will not stand for it. And another man confidently told his daughter why he had turned down a position with an English film company in 1936. He said, "The Germans will not do anything to me. I am a war veteran. I have the Iron Cross." And another man brushed off Nazi rule by comparing it to rain, where people opened their umbrellas and waited for it to stop. So they only really dismissed wholesale accounts of mass murder. Some believed, but the majority did not. A man escaped from a train going to Auschwitz, and when he got back to Poland and spoke about the massacres they could expect, they said he was lying and frightening everybody. And then another man escaped in the same year from a train going to Chelmno, that was 1942. And when he got back to his relatives in Warsaw and told of the slaughter ahead, they said to him, "It's far-fetched," and they didn't believe him. So even the events of Kristallnacht failed to influence many people. That was the night of broken glass. On the 9th and 10th of November 1938, the Nazis burned many synagogues across Germany, and they destroyed or ransacked Jewish homes, offices, and shops. They rounded up a lot of Jewish men and sent them to concentration camps, and they murdered others. And in one notable incident, a man who had befriended a Jewish child while he was a boy, even eaten at the Jew's home, now led a group of stormtroopers in threatening the boy's parents and then trashing their home. So you have to consider all that as background. And then war broke out in September 1939. And the persecution intensified. That was when hundreds of thousands of Jews were packed into cattle cars for the tortuous journeys to the death camps. There was no room to move, no space to feed babies, no medication to take, and little air to breathe. They had to make do with one bucket to defecate and urinate in, and that soon overflowed. Imagine standing like that for 3 or 4 days with little or no food and soiling your clothes because there was nowhere else to go. And if you were unfortunate enough to come from Thessalonica, Greece, that train journey took 9 days. There was panic broke out in one train going to Mauthausen when a rumor spread that they would all be burned alive. So a female doctor cut open the veins in her wrists and legs, and then she did the same for about 30 women who preferred to commit suicide. When they arrived, they were tired and hungry and gasping for anything to drink. Nobody was there to rid them of the smell of their bowels or the stench of the rotting dead. Instead, they were met by booted Nazis screaming at them to line up for selections where they would either be forced into slavery or gassed. And laggards were shot on the spot, and ferocious dogs bit those who were too dazed to know what was going on. The cruelest part of all was that they had done nothing wrong. They were being degraded and beaten, starved and murdered only because they were Jews. An entire people was being annihilated simply because they were Jewish. Anti-Semitism had reached such a crescendo that the Nazis considered them vermin. They couldn't fight back. They had no weapons. And they were facing well-armed fanatics who thought nothing of exacting reprisals. And nothing tamed the Jews more than the fear of reprisals against family, relatives, friends, and fellow Jews. And others reacted like human beings. They expected something to turn up in their favor, even when all seemed lost. The heartache, you have to listen now to some of the people who were there. The heartache of a man who saw his mother, sister, and brother being sent away to be gassed. And he said, there was no time to say anything. Nothing, nothing, nothing. We were in hell. And another girl who saw her mother with a frail heart being sent off to be gassed, she said, from that moment, I lost my emotions. I didn't know how to cry. One boy who lives in Rockville now, a retired professor from Carnegie Mellon University in engineering. He wrote a blurb for my back cover, Stephen Fenves. He hid from the selections by hiding in the latrines with excrement up to his mouth. And the Nazis were so pitiless in what they were doing that 2 girls hid between corpses to prevent those selections. They were dehumanized in every possible way. Nobody was henceforth known by their names, only by the tattooed numbers on their forearms. And they thought they were lucky, thankful that they hadn't been tattooed on their cheeks or foreheads. 4 women realized that they only had one bowl between them, so they each defecated in it. Then they threw out the contents, and half an hour later drank soup from the very same bowl. They saw people eating human flesh because cannibalism saved them from starvation. Women stopped having their periods, and others washed their hair in colored water served up as soup. When they went to the latrines, they expected to be brushed by somebody dead hanging above them, just like they expected to get wet when swimming. And if they failed to follow orders properly at roll call, they were made to hop on all fours like frogs. A preteen girl awoke in the morning to discover that she was hugging a woman who died overnight. And then everybody fought over the thin slice of bread that she must have left behind. And another girl saw her mother walking off to be gassed. And she said, "I'm only 18. I haven't even made love." A man looked at footwear brought into the ghetto by a Nazi known as the Butcher, and he recognized his own mother's shoes. They considered death a luxury because the ordeal of suffering was over. And then there were the medical experiments on people who had absolutely nothing wrong with them. Twins and dwarfs, in particular, suffered excruciating pain, and many died from the barbarism. Women were sterilized in painful procedures, and some men had their testicles removed. Teachers gave poison candy to their pupils, expecting them to die before the Nazis could get them. And one man had to kneel before a dog and address him as Herr, and then apologizing for stealing food from his bowl. Witnesses to murder close up. Nobody was better positioned to talk about it than those who really saw it close up, the Sonderkommandos. They were the people whose terrible task was to supervise the gassing and then to remove the bodies to the ovens. And they were killed, all of them, after 6 months, and other men brought in as replacements. It was hoped then that nobody would survive to tell about the horrors. But in the confusion and liberation, some of them did manage to escape. And their memoirs put paid to some of the fantasies of the deniers, but they never spoke to one another, barely spoke. They carried out these horrible tasks because, as one man said, he remembered what his mother had told him, that where there is life, there is hope. Now, Shlomo Venezia was one of those Sonderkommandos. He died last year. But before he died, he wrote a marvelous book, and he exposed the atrocities. He writes about putting the people in the gas chamber, and then when all the screaming and crying was hushed, they opened the door, and they had to wade through excrement and urine, blood and vomit. One day, they heard a baby crying, and they went over and found that a 2-month-old girl had survived by suckling her mother's breast. But then along came a Nazi guard and shot her in the back of the head. That was the end of that one. Death was considered cheap and easily achieved if desired. And now we go to the instances of bravery, of courage. There was a woman who escaped from a camp, and she was caught and brought back to the gallows to be hanged. The camp commandant was standing next to her, and he said, "If I forgive you, what will you do?" And she spat in his face and said, "I will do the same thing again." So he hanged her and let her dangle for days. And then there were 5 boys who were arrested for stealing cigarettes meant for German troops. So they were thrown in a cell for a week without any food or water. And then they were taken up to the gallows with the nooses around their necks. They didn't give the Germans a chance. While the reasons for their fates was being read out, they jumped off the stools to commit collective suicide. Now, this is a story that I think is the best of all in the book. The Nazis gave one man 30 minutes to offload a truck, or he would be shot dead. He happened to be a concert cellist, and he knew that Saint-Saëns cello concerto took 23 minutes to play. So he hummed it to himself. And of course, he finished 7 minutes ahead of schedule and saved his life. They didn't have a uniform relationship with God. There was a rabbi who went to his burning synagogue, and he walked up to the ark, and addressing God, he said, "Many times I have come here and asked you to forgive the sins of my community. Now, as I stand before you, I don't think we will forgive you your sins." And then there was another man who looked at his neighbor who was praying, and he said to him, "Why are you praying? Can't you see that we've been abandoned and our miserable condition?" And the devout man replied to him and said, "You don't understand. I'm praying to God to thank him for not making me like the murderers around him." You see the wisdom of this. It comes through in a lot of stories. One man arrived at a concentration camp. He was very, very religious. But then he saw how long these people had suffered for. And he said, "I can understand if God was angry with the Jews and penalized them for days or weeks, maybe months, but not year after year. I am angry with God. I have a problem with him." Then there were others who died with dignity and spirit. An old rabbi saw other people waiting to be gassed like him, and he said to them, "There's nothing to be afraid of death. We will die as martyrs." So they sang and they danced as they went through the door to their deaths. How did they pick up their lives? When most of them were freed in the spring of 1945. There was a woman who was freed from Landsberg, but 38 years later she was on the west coast of America, and she found out she was sitting next to a soldier who had helped free her camp. So she went up to him, she shrieked hysterically, clutched his arm, and sobbing and whimpering, she said she had found her savior. There was a woman who told people at a speech she gave all about the horrors of Auschwitz. And at the end, somebody stood up and said, "Why did you bring children into this world if Auschwitz was so terrible?" And she said, "Hitler had wanted to eliminate us. I got my revenge by saying, 'Look, we are here.'" And then another lady compared her concentration camp to the pain of having, she said, it was like the pain of having babies. You always remember the beauty, never the pain. Otherwise, women would never have babies. And their ordeal would really never end. There was a man called David Yeager who came from Auschwitz to Washington, D.C., got a job at Duke Siebert's famous restaurant in Connecticut Avenue. And one day he heard that the leader of the American Nazis, George Lincoln Rockwell, would be addressing people on the mall. He decided to go, but he swore to himself that he would not be like many Jews in Europe who, he said, prayed the minute the Nazis burst in. So he went down, and he was horrified to see swastikas and people with crossed arms, just like the Gestapo. And then he approached a Marine who turned Nazi, and he said, "Didn't we suffer enough under Hitler?" And the Marine said to him, "Who are you to say that?" And he showed him his tattoo on his arm. He said, "I got that in Auschwitz." And the Marine said, "You're lying. How much did you pay to have it put on?" "We're going to build bigger and better gas chambers than the Nazis ever had." That was when David Yeager jumped over the rope and started a riot. And the Marine tried to poke out his eyes, but he managed to tear off the Marine's ear. And then a policeman intervened, dragged off Yeager, and booked him, and he was fined. Now, the Nazis found out where he lived, and they phoned him, and they said, "We're going to kill you, your wife, and your children." So his friends protected the family while he went back to work. But then he had to go to court. And the judge said to him, "Mr. Yeager, you've suffered enough under the Nazis. Why don't you go downstairs, get back your money? We'll make believe it never happened." Then there were ghastly encounters with people who pretended to be Gentiles. A woman went from a concentration camp back to Poland to see her sister, who had been baptized and hidden with the Catholic family. And the sister said to her, I was saved because I became a Gentile. And she even went to Mass to atone for the sins of her parents, who she said had killed Jesus. And that was when the sister, the other one, the survivor, said, I have lived as a Jew, I have suffered as a Jew, and I will die as a Jew. And then a woman passed through Nuremberg on her way back to her place of residence after visiting England, and she saw German children begging for anything to eat. And even though she had chocolates and oranges in her suitcase, she refused to give them any. It was as if they had killed all the victims, all the people who've been murdered. Only later did she say she changed her mind. And in New York, there was a daughter of a Holocaust survivor who represented the tax division of a large legal firm at a meeting with German clients. And afterwards, she told one of her colleagues that she felt very uncomfortable in the presence of German middle-aged men. And her colleague said, don't you know that you were speaking to von Ribbentrop? That was Hitler's, the son of Hitler's foreign minister. And when he said that, all the color drained from her face, and she was speechless. Another man had seen Jews hanging upside down by their feet at Birkenau. And he did only one thing for those who were murdered afterwards. He said, every day I said the memorial prayer for the dead, just as they would have done for my parents and my sister and my brother. But he had one word of advice for future generations. He said, unless we know about it and tell others about it, it is bound to happen again. Now I want to end with this one. There was an American major and his aide who were told that there was a top-ranking Nazi living in a chalet on a hill in Waldring, Austria, but they didn't know his name. So they set off on their jeep to arrest him. The major went up the stairs with his revolver at the ready, and all he saw was an artist with an easel next to him painting the Alps opposite. So he said to the man, who are you? And he said, I am Julius Stieler. And it matched the name on his ID. And then the major saw the initials JS printed on a card. And out of the blue, he said, are you Julius Streicher? And the man said, yes, that's who I am. In the jeep going back, the major said to him, are you the Julius Streicher who hated Jews so much? That's who I am, said the man, who had been editor of the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper, Der Stürmer. But the major didn't shoot him because he didn't believe in killing anybody who had surrendered. However, as they got to Berchtesgaden, he booted him to accelerate his departure. And then a reporter came up and said to him, you've just killed one of the biggest stories of the war. And the major said, how come? He said, can you imagine if a man called Cohen or Goldberg or Levy had arrested this anti-Semite? What a story that would have been. And the major said, why? And he said, because a Jew would be arresting Streicher. And Major Henry Plitz said, but I am Jewish. And that's when the camera started whirring. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. I want to start with what you started with, heritage. And specifically, you listed off Babylonian times, Roman, Persian times. Human beings tend to continue to be cruel to each other throughout history, whether that's African Americans, indigenous people, Indians, wherever it is, Jewish people, as you described. And you said they were treated the way they were because they were Jewish. So I'd like to maybe from your historical perspective, say, why did that trend continue from the perspective of, you said, this point in time, this Jewish group made this Pharaoh angry, or whatever it is, what was it that compounded throughout history? There's no justification for it, but what we learned from our parents and from our peers is how Germany decided to use that story to give their people a reason to cause the Jews so much pain. So I'm curious if you were to go back to a point in time, if you can, say, this is why Jewish people have been treated this way.
Are you saying, I don't think I heard the beginning, but are you saying what is the reason for anti-Semitism?
In a sense of, from a historical perspective, where is this point, whether it's biblical or this Jewish tribe did this to this group that can carry it on throughout time? I know there's a lot of structure and history in Europe that continues on, but if you could go back to some point from your perspective.
I think if I could answer that, I'd be called Solomon. It's beyond me why so many people dislike Jews. They've distinguished themselves, many Nobel laureates, the America, the beautiful, they're all Jews. And I don't know, it might be jealousy, it might be that they worship another in another way. I don't know. They're smart because many professions were denied them. We're not allowed to be farmers and everything else. And I think that sharpened their outlook on life, that they had to be, their wits about them to survive so many persecutions. But I don't know the reason for it. It's made an extraordinary comeback now, anti-Semitism. I think this is related to the changing demographics of Europe. It might be the reason, but which is political, but I don't know why in the past it happened under so many people, but it did. And I'm sorry, but that's the best answer I can give.
Thank you.
There must be others. I finished early just to make sure that there would be room for questions. Yeah.
I didn't think I'd have this opportunity. What made you take up this subject after an exhaustive career in studying Lincoln?
What made me write this?
Yes, what turned you to this subject?
I look for 3 criteria in books. They have to be true, they have to be epic, and they have to be horrific. Somehow I'm attracted to that. I don't know why. People ask me to write funny things, I can't. But that's why I wrote the assassination of Lincoln, the burning of the White House in Washington, Vietnam, and I've got a book coming out in March, which is called Lynched, They Got Away with Murder. It's a true story of a lynching in Georgia in 1946 of about 10,000 documents under Freedom of Information Act. But they all somehow, they're poles apart in the intensity of that horror, but they all fit the mold. And that's why I'm looking for a subject now. If you can think of one that hasn't been written about before, that is epic, true, and horrific, come to me. That was the reason that I went for that. But there was another reason. There was this man called Dieudonné Mbala that I mentioned earlier. He's a Frenchman. And when I saw how he made fun of the Holocaust, I just couldn't stand it any longer. And I had to reply to him because he was so glib and people rocked with laughter. And I thought, this is not a funny subject. You can't deny it happened. And I thought, honestly, that the best answer I could give him would be the words of those who came out of those death camps alive, the survivors. And that's why I wrote it, really. That was the impelling force that prompted me to write this. Yes.
There was a letter that was left in a bottle in Warsaw Ghetto. A person who was about to die. It was a Molotov cocktail originally, but he poured it over himself and stuffed it in. And it was a similar kind of struggle with his belief in God that he's writing there, that he wasn't going to forgive God. He said he still believed because he always did, and he believed in good times he'd have to believe back. And said that, well, God must have turned his way for a moment. But it was interesting that he had that same kind of quote that you'd given earlier with it, that he said, but I can thank God for having not made me one of those who are coming to get me now. And, have you ever heard of that letter? It was...
Would you mind telling me what he said?
The question really was for a letter buried in a milk bottle in Warsaw, with the individual saying, "Thank God for not having made me like those who are coming to get me." Are you familiar with that story or others like it?
Yes, thank you. I'm familiar with the story. It actually is funny. The quote that I gave, that I'm thankful that God didn't make the murders like the murders around me, comes from another man. But it seems to be the same quote, but different circumstances, because it was definitely not the man that you talk about. But there is so much wisdom. It's pervasive in this book, and if you really don't have to look for it, it's there all the time. It's extraordinary what they survived. Yes.
What do you think of movies like Chaplin's The Great Dictator and Mel Brooks' The Producers and the musical The Producers, which try to make fun of Hitler and use the Nazis for comedy?
It's a good question. We have the First Amendment right of free speech, and you may not agree with it, but it's enshrined and in the amendments, and I believe in that free speech. The Nazis marching through Skokie was unbearable, intolerable, but they had the right of free speech. And that's something that does not exist in the Middle East, where I lived for 12 years. It doesn't exist at all. And I think that's an incredible tribute to America, that we allow people to say what they want, where they want. I am a firm believer in the First Amendment, and I don't agree at all with those who would perform things like that, but they have a right.
I have a slight disagreement with the Skokie example. I think that the limit on free speech, when it is not used to try and convince people, to talk to people about something, but as a deliberate act to try and inflict on people, is a different thing. Burning a cross on someone's lawn, or even on where they have a right to the property, burning the cross or something by a Ku Klux Klan, is not speech. It's not trying to convince other people. It's trying to terrorize. When speech is used to terrorize, I don't think it's protected.
I think a judge would agree with you on that, that burning a cross is not considered free speech, and it's on private property, so they would convict them. But the Skokie parade by Nazis, I take issue with you, and we'll argue until the cows come home. But we're really...
But was the purpose of the Skokie March to convince people as a speech, or was it to terrorize and traumatize the people? Since they were marching through a predominantly Jewish area, it's hard for me to believe they were trying to convince anyone.
You're right. You're right. But I disagree on you on the subject of free speech. They were inciting, which they might have been held up for, but they had the right to do it. A judge gave them the right. You know, there was somebody, two people displayed the a flag of ISIS right outside the British Parliament a few days ago, and the police let them continue because they hadn't broken any law. And it was said by those in authority that they had the right to do it. It's obviously that nobody here would agree with that. They don't like it, but that's what the police said. They had a right to do it.
You mentioned some stories of why people couldn't get out of Europe, why Jews couldn't get out of Europe, and you may have mentioned some already, but I was wondering, do you have stories of people who tried to get out but couldn't, or people who successfully got out?
Do you have stories about people who either tried to get out but couldn't, or people who were successful in getting out?
Well, there's a story of the lady who was on the gallows, who spat in the Count Commandant's face. She escaped, she was caught. They did have a lot of impediments that stopped people escaping. That's why so few managed to do it. But I don't recall that I don't recall having one where they actually escaped.
I actually meant like when the persecution started before they were shipped to the camps.
Well,
Once again, emigrating out of Europe once the persecution started in the 1930s. Do you have stories to that effect?
no, but I do mention that in the 1930s, when it was quite obvious what was going to happen, regardless of what Churchill said, warned rather, I think that a lot of people were so ensconced in the culture of the times. They said, we're Germans. It's not going to happen to us. And that's why they gave the examples of the person who didn't take up a position in Brazil, the person who didn't join a film company in London, the person who compared to rain. They didn't understand and they didn't appreciate what was happening. It was inevitable what would happen. And even after the Nuremberg laws, they didn't realize that their lives were in danger, and they should have fled. But the problem was, I have a lot of stories where people say, if only Israel had existed then, they would have had somewhere to run to. And that comes up time and again. They had nowhere to go. The quota system was filled up. What was that? St. Louis was turned back. The ship with refugees was turned back, and they were sent off to concentration camps. So they were really boxed in. Some people fled. I've got many stories where they fled to Antwerp and other places in France. And they survived the war. And I spoke last week to a fellow who was hidden just outside Berlin for the entire period of the war. I was hidden in a village, and he survived. And I spoke to him, and I said, it's marvelous that you mentioned the name of the family that protected you. They were Gentiles, and alerted Yad Vashem in Israel so that they would be called the righteous Gentiles. But there are a lot of those, yeah. Yes.
You said in the beginning that one reason you wrote this book was because of the great increase in anti-Semitism in France. So after the recent murders of Jews in France, the Israeli Prime Minister encouraged French Jews to emigrate to Israel. Given what you've said about the stories of people who wish they had left Germany in the 1930s, would you suggest that French Jews move to Israel?
It's a very good question, but there's a very great difference. The Nazis were in control of the government. None of these extremists currently holds any position of authority in Europe. The governments are controlled by people who were elected democratically. That's the great difference. If any one of those governments came into power and then sanctioned what we've talked about, anti-Semitism, then I would say to them, get out. But at the moment, it's a very, very strong government feeling against these people. And the French Prime Minister is married to a Jew. So he is very outspoken in his words against the extremists. And that's the very, very great difference, that they don't have the backing of the government.
Anthony, thank you for your time.